Ebel arrived at the Nwoko compound just as the sun was bowing to the horizon, its orange glow resting softly on the walls of clay and gold. Her white wrapper fluttered gently in the breeze, and the villagers whispered as she passed, the girl who had married into wealth. She smiled shyly, her steps light and cautious. In her heart, she prayed that this new chapter would bring peace, love, and perhaps a chance to heal from the years of hardship she had known. Her husband, Chaik, had been kind during courtship, speaking gently and promising her a life free of want. But as she stepped into the family courtyard, her eyes met those of Madame Nwoko, and something in that gaze made her heart falter. The old woman's eyes were sharp, her lips pressed tight as though she had just swallowed bitterness. She looked Ebel up and down, her gaze lingering on the girl's small frame and soft voice. Madame Nwoko murmured, her voice carrying the authority of one used to command. So this is the wife my son has chosen. Her tone carried no warmth. Chaik tried to smile, pretending not to notice, but Ebel felt the chill crawl up her spine. That evening, as they sat for the welcome meal, Ebel noticed the glances between the servants. They seemed afraid of Madame Nwoko, who dictated every move, who ate first, who sat where, even how much food each person received. When Ebel reached for a piece of yam, Madame Nwoko's voice sliced through the room. A bride must eat last, she said with a calm smile that did not reach her eyes. Respect is the first test of a woman's worth. Ebel quickly withdrew her hand, her stomach twisting in embarrassment. She ate only when the others were done, the remaining food cold and meager. Later that night she told Chaik she was hungry. He hesitated before replying. Mother is strict, he said softly, avoiding her eyes. But she means well. She just needs time to accept you. His words tried to comfort, but his tone lacked conviction. Ebel lay awake long after he slept, her stomach empty, her mind full of unease. She had entered a house full of rules written by someone who saw kindness as a weakness to exploit. In the following days, Ebel's gentle nature became a target. Madame Nwoko mocked her for her quietness, calling her a mouse who thinks she can sit with lions. Servants were ordered to watch her closely, to report if she wasted food or showed disrespect. Ebel began to shrink into herself, afraid to speak, afraid to breathe too loudly. Every act of obedience only seemed to feed the older woman's cruelty. But beneath her soft eyes, a quiet strength simmered, one she did not yet know she carried. She endured each day with patience, whispering prayers into the wind. She would kneel by the small garden behind the compound, touching the soil and remembering her mother's words, "The earth always feeds those who listen to it." Though she came hungry, she still smiled at the servants, still offered help where she could, even when her body trembled from hunger. She began saving tiny crumbs, pressing them into the soil of a hidden corner behind the kitchen. There she planted seeds, not just of food but of defiance. No one saw the flicker of resolve that began to bloom behind her eyes. While Madame Nwoko thought she was breaking her, Ebel was quietly learning. She had come hungry, yes, but hunger had a way of sharpening the soul, of waking something fierce within the gentle. Each morning the smell of steaming yam porridge drifted through the courtyard, teasing Ebel's empty stomach. The household would gather for breakfast. Madame Nwoko at the head of the table, Chaik beside her, the servants moving briskly with trays. Everyone was served large portions, thick yam slices, fried plantains glistening with oil, soup rich with palm and pepper. When it came to Ebel's turn, her bowl was set down almost gently, but it was always the smallest, half empty, with the thinnest broth and barely a bite of meat. At first she thought it was a mistake. She smiled, thanked the servants and ate quietly. But the pattern continued day after day. When she reached for seconds, Madame Nwoko's sharp voice would cut through the air. A true woman knows how to be content with what she has. You must learn moderation, my daughter. The servants froze. Chaik would shift uncomfortably, sometimes pretending not to notice, sometimes excusing himself from the table altogether. Ebel's body began to weaken. Her once bright eyes dimmed, her steps slowed, and her hands trembled when she lifted the calabash of water to her lips. The villagers who once admired her beauty now whispered about how thin she had become. But Ebel said nothing. She carried her hunger like a secret, pressing her hands to her stomach as if holding herself together. At night, her hunger became a cruel companion. She could hear her belly rumbling in the silence, like a beast that refused to be tamed. Sometimes she would walk to the courtyard, kneel before the small patch of soil where she had planted seeds weeks ago, and whisper prayers over them. "Earth, keep me alive," she murmured. "Let my patience grow as quietly as your roots." One night, a kind servant girl named Ifyananya slipped into her room. She brought a small bowl of beans hidden under her shawl. "Madam will kill me if she knows," the girl whispered, "but I can't watch you starve." Ebel smiled weakly and took a small bite, tears gathering in her eyes. "You are brave," she said softly. "But don't endanger yourself. God sees. The earth sees. The truth will come." Her words were calm, but deep inside she was unraveling. Hunger had begun to feel like a fog, dulling her senses. The world seemed slower, her strength fading like smoke. Yet even in her frailty something sacred stirred, a strange peace as though a whisper lived beneath her suffering. Madame Nwoko, watching her from a distance, grew more confident in her cruelty. "Weak," she would mutter. "Too weak to stand. How can she bear children if she cannot even feed herself properly?" She would then smile sweetly whenever visitors came, praising Ebel as a gentle soul who eats little, works hard, and never complains. And it was true, Ebel never complained. Her silence became her armor, her prayers her hidden rebellion. One afternoon, as she was washing clothes by the river, her reflection in the water startled her. Her face was pale, her collarbones sharp, her lips dry. But her eyes were alive. They glowed faintly with something she didn't understand, like light hidden beneath water. She leaned closer, and the wind seemed to carry her mother's voice. "When the body weakens, the spirit prepares to rise." She began to pray more deeply after that, not for food but for clarity. She prayed for the strength to understand her suffering, for the patience to see its purpose. The other women in the household began to notice strange things. Though Ebel ate so little, she never fainted. Though her meals were meager, her gaze grew steadier, and her voice, when she finally spoke, carried quiet authority. The days passed, and her bowl remained half empty, but the hunger no longer controlled her. Each pang became a heartbeat of resolve, each moment of weakness a reminder that power was not only in flesh. Something within her was shifting, quietly, invisibly. And as Madame Nwoko smiled at her small bowl, believing she was breaking her, she never saw that Ebel was no longer the one starving. It was her cruelty that was beginning to hunger, for control, for fear, for victory, and it would soon find itself starved of all three. The nights in the Nwoko compound were heavy with silence, the kind that seemed to listen. Ebel often lay awake on her raffia mat, her hands resting on her empty stomach, counting the distant croaks of frogs near the stream. Hunger had made her body fragile, but her mind had grown sharper. Every sound now carried meaning, the creak of a door, the shuffling of feet, the low hum of women's gossip carried by the wind. One night, as the moon hung pale above the courtyard, she heard the sound of hushed voices beyond her window. The servants were talking near the kitchen, their whispers trembling with fear and curiosity. Ebel closed her eyes and listened. "I heard Madame talking to the herbalist again," one of them said. "She says the girl carries her mother's blessing, something hidden in her blood." "She means witchcraft," another replied quickly. "She believes if the girl keeps fasting, the spirits will abandon her." There was a pause, then a nervous laugh. "But Ebel's mother, didn't people say she cured the chief's son with just her hands? That she spoke to rivers?" Ebel's heart stopped. The words pierced through the dark like lightning. Her mother, Mama Onyema, had been known far beyond their old village. She had been gentle but strong, a healer whose songs could calm storms. But after her death, Ebel had never heard anyone speak her name in this house. She thought her memory had died with her. Now she understood. Madame Nwoko had known all along. She pressed her palm to her chest, feeling her heart thud. Starving me, she thought bitterly, is not to punish but to weaken what she fears. The realization hit her with cold fire. Outside, the whispers continued. Madame says no spirit can survive on an empty stomach. She wants to drain the girl's strength before the planting festival. There's talk she'll offer her spirit to the ancestors for wealth. The women fell silent after that, as if the night itself had warned them. Ebel turned her face to the wall, trembling. Her mother's blessing, the gift she had never understood, had become a curse in the eyes of the woman who ruled her life. Tears slipped quietly from her eyes, but they were not tears of weakness. They were tears of awakening. Her mother had once said, "When they try to starve your body, let your soul learn to feed itself." Ebel finally understood. That night she rose slowly, her bones aching, and knelt by the window. The moonlight spilled across her thin frame like silver cloth. She closed her eyes and began to hum an old melody her mother used to sing while grinding herbs, a song that smelled of rain and smoke, a song of protection and endurance. The wind answered. It was soft at first, brushing her cheek like a mother's touch. Then it grew stronger, swirling gently through her room, lifting the edge of her mat. The small clay lamp flickered, and Ebel's hunger faded for a moment. In its place came warmth, faint but steady, blooming from her chest outward, as though something inside her remembered how to live. When she lay back down, her eyes were dry. She felt the world shifting, as if the air itself now carried her mother's breath. For the first time since her marriage, she did not dream of food or pain. She dreamed of light filtering through roots underground, of hands stirring water, of a voice saying, "They can starve the flesh but not the seed." By dawn, when the first cock crowed, she rose with renewed calm. The servants saw her walking to the courtyard to sweep, her steps slow but graceful, her face strangely serene. None of them spoke of what they'd whispered the night before, but when they looked at her, a quiet unease stirred among them. They didn't know why, but Ebel no longer looked weak. She looked as if she knew something they didn't, as if her silence had begun to speak. The night the spirit came, the moon was hidden behind clouds. The compound slept in its usual stillness, the kind of silence that pressed against Ebel's ears and made her heart sound too loud. She had been sent to the storeroom after everyone had eaten, to count sacks of grain she would never taste. Her stomach twisted painfully as she moved between the baskets, the smell of roasted yam and oil still lingering in the air. When she finished, she sat against the cold mud wall, tears slipping silently down her face. She wasn't sure if she was crying from hunger, or from the cruel weight of being unseen. The flickering oil lamp threw long shadows across the floor, and in that lonely light she whispered, "Mother, if your spirit still walks, see your daughter. Give me strength. I am fading." The wind shifted suddenly. The flame of the lamp bent sideways and the air grew cool. From the doorway came the soft shuffle of footsteps, not hurried, not hesitant, but steady, as though they belonged to someone who knew exactly where to find her. Ebel wiped her face quickly and rose, her heart thudding. In the dim glow stood an old woman wrapped in a faded indigo cloth. Her back was straight despite her age, and her eyes gleamed with a strange gentleness that seemed to see through time. "My child," the woman said softly, her voice like dry leaves brushing together, "why do you cry when the ground beneath you is already listening?" Ebel froze. "Who are you?" she whispered, though her body felt no fear, only recognition, deep and unspoken. The woman smiled faintly. "Just a passerby who hears hunger better than most." She reached into her woven bag and drew out a small calabash, no larger than a closed hand. It was carved with ancient symbols, its rim lined with faint golden dust. "Drink when hunger burns," she said, holding it out. "But not for the belly, for the heart. Strength does not always come from food." Ebel hesitated. The woman's presence felt both human and otherworldly. Her scent was of rain on clay and the soft smoke of healing herbs. "I don't understand," Ebel said quietly, her fingers trembling as she took the calabash. "You will," the woman murmured. "When the body is starved, the spirit hungers too. Feed the one that lasts longer." Ebel lifted the calabash to her lips. The liquid inside was cool and faintly sweet, like the taste of early morning dew. The moment it touched her tongue, warmth spread through her, not in her stomach but in her chest, her arms, her fingertips. Her breath deepened, her trembling stopped. It felt as though she had swallowed light itself. She looked up, tears shining in her eyes. "Who sent you?" The woman's gaze softened, and for a heartbeat, her face seemed to shimmer, younger, familiar. "You called me," she said simply. "And the one who loves you most still walks beside you." Ebel blinked, and in that instant the old woman's form seemed to dissolve into a faint mist. A cool breeze swept through the storeroom and the lamp flame straightened. The air smelled faintly of her mother's old healing balm, crushed leaves and honey. Ebel sat there long after the spirit had vanished, the calabash still warm in her hands. She felt calm for the first time in months. The gnawing pain in her belly was gone, replaced by something vast and deep, like roots spreading quietly through the earth. The next morning, the servants noticed her eyes. They were clearer, brighter, almost luminous. She worked silently as always, sweeping, grinding pepper, fetching water. But she no longer wavered. Her steps were light, her back straight. Even Madame Nwoko frowned when she saw her. "You've found your second wind, haven't you?" she muttered. "But let's see how long it lasts." Ebel said nothing. She only bowed her head and smiled faintly. That night, as she sat on her mat, she opened the calabash once more. The liquid shimmered softly, still full though she had drunk deeply from it. She placed it to her heart and whispered, "Thank you." From the shadows, the wind stirred gently, carrying a whisper that only she could hear. Strength does not always come from food. Sometimes it grows from the hunger they cannot see. Madame Nwoko watched from the veranda one humid afternoon, her lips tightening as she saw Ebel pounding yam beneath the rising sun. Sweat glistened on the young woman's brow, her hands moving rhythmically with the pestle, each thud echoing across the courtyard like a heartbeat. She had expected Ebel to collapse long ago, thin, faint, begging for mercy. But instead, Ebel moved with quiet grace, her shoulders strong, her eyes calm, her face glowing faintly in the light. It made Madame Nwoko's stomach twist with unease. This was not the look of a woman starving. It was the look of someone being sustained by something she couldn't explain. "You think your little prayers make you strong?" Madame Nwoko hissed under her breath. "We shall see what prayers do when work becomes a storm." That evening she called the servants. "From tomorrow," she declared, "Ebel will take charge of all courtyard duties. The rest of you will assist me in the storehouse." The servants exchanged nervous glances. They knew what that meant. The courtyard was large, the chores endless. Sweeping, pounding, fetching water from the far stream, scrubbing the compound floor until it shone like river stones. It was work meant to break a person's back. At dawn, before the first rooster crowed, Ebel began. The pestle rose and fell, the broom swept, the buckets sloshed. The air was thick with dust and heat, but her movements never faltered. The ache in her arms came and went like passing clouds. When she paused to breathe, she could feel that same warmth flowing through her veins, the same one that had spread through her body the night she drank from the calabash. She noticed how her body no longer trembled from hunger. The hollow ache in her belly had vanished entirely. Instead, a deep calm lived within her, as though her breath itself fed her. The air carried whispers she could almost understand. The rhythm of her chores became like prayer, and even the smallest task felt sacred. By midday, Madame Nwoko came to inspect her progress, expecting to find her collapsed. Instead, Ebel stood tall, sweeping the last of the leaves into a neat pile. Her wrapper clung to her skin, her hair shimmered faintly in the sunlight. She bowed respectfully. "Mother, the work is done." Madame Nwoko's face hardened. "Done? Already?" "Yes, mother." The older woman's eyes narrowed. "You have tricks. You must." She snatched the broom from Ebel's hand and struck it against the ground. "Clean it again. Every corner. Every wall. Until I can see my reflection." Ebel nodded without protest and continued, her movements steady and quiet. By nightfall, the courtyard shone. The servants, peeking from their quarters, whispered among themselves. "How is she still standing?" one said. "She hasn't eaten more than a handful of Ghanian days." When Ebel finally lay down that night, she felt no exhaustion. Instead, her dreams were filled with soft voices, women's voices, layered like waves. They sang the same song her mother once hummed while grinding herbs. "When the flesh tires, the spirit wakes. When the world starves you, feed on light." The next morning, Madame Nwoko set an even harsher test. She handed Ebel a heavy basket filled with wet cassava roots and ordered her to carry it from the compound to the drying fields beyond the hill. The path was steep and rough, the sun merciless. Yet Ebel climbed with calm, each step steady, her breath deep and even. Midway up, she paused, looking at her hands. The skin was glowing faintly, not burning, not shining, but alive, like a candle hidden under her flesh. At the top of the hill, she looked back. The wind brushed her face, and for a moment she felt her mother's presence again, warm, approving, proud. The basket felt light as air. When she returned, Madame Nwoko was waiting. She searched Ebel's face for signs of strain but found none. Her voice faltered as she asked, "What are you?" Ebel only smiled, her tone soft but steady. "A woman who remembers where strength comes from." Madame Nwoko turned away, unsettled by something she couldn't name. She had tried to starve Ebel's body, but she had awakened something far more enduring. And as night fell over the compound, the older woman lay awake, listening to the faint rhythm of Ebel's pestle still echoing, steady, tireless, eternal, like the heart of something ancient that refused to break. Ebel woke from the dream with a strange ache in her chest, not of hunger but of remembrance. Her mother's voice had sounded so real, carried on the wind that whispered through the tall grasses of that endless golden field. "What they withhold, the earth will give," the words repeated like a heartbeat in her mind. As she sat up in the dim light of dawn, she saw something glimmering on the floor beside her mat, tiny green shoots pushing through the cracks in the dry earth, right where her tears had fallen the night before. At first, she thought it was her imagination, perhaps roots left behind by stray seeds. But as she brushed her fingers over them, the little plants seemed to respond, unfurling leaves as soft as silk. They smelled faintly sweet like corn at harvest. She gasped quietly, clutching her hands to her chest. Something deep within her, something old and sacred, was awakening. That morning when the others mocked her thin frame and empty plate, Ebel smiled. She ate nothing but her steps were lighter. When she walked past the courtyard, the ground behind her shimmered faintly, the dust moistening as if kissed by hidden rain. Madame Nwoko noticed the change and grew uneasy. The girl's eyes, once dull with starvation, now held a calm brightness that seemed to look straight through her cruelty. Days passed, and Ebel began to understand the meaning of her mother's words. The hunger that once gnawed at her was gone, replaced by a quiet strength that pulsed from the soil beneath her feet. When she watered the withering herbs in the corner of the yard, they bloomed again, lush and fragrant. Even the servants whispered in awe, saying that Ebel's presence brought life to dying plants. One evening, while gathering firewood, she knelt to rest and whispered a prayer of gratitude. Her tears, tears of both sorrow and wonder, fell onto the dusty ground. Within moments, small sprouts rose where they landed, glowing faintly in the twilight. Ebel smiled through her tears, realizing what her mother had meant. Her power did not depend on food or favor, or the mercy of cruel hearts. It came from within, a blessing older than fear, born from the bond between her spirit and the earth itself. Madame Nwoko soon began to notice the impossible changes. The barren garden, long abandoned, now thrived. Fruit trees that had stopped bearing began to flower again. Wherever Ebel walked, life followed, soft green shoots, blooming petals, whispers of rain. The villagers started to murmur that perhaps the girl carried her mother's sacred gift after all. But Ebel said nothing. She kept her secret close, knowing the day would come when truth would reveal itself without her needing to speak. Her mother's promise had taken root, in her heart, in the soil, and in every small miracle that grew beneath her silent strength. As the sun rose over the red clay roofs of the village, the air buzzed with the excitement of the coming harvest festival. Drummers practiced in the square, women wove garlands of yam vines and palm fronds, and children chased each other with laughter that echoed across the fields. It was a time of celebration, the season when the land gave back what the people had planted with faith and sweat. But that year something strange began to unfold. The skies grew heavy, not with rain but with stillness. The once green fields beyond the Nwoko compound began to fade, their leaves curling inward like dying tongues. The river that usually sang through the valley thinned to a whisper. Farmers returned from their plots with empty baskets, shaking their heads in disbelief. The yams were shrinking in the soil, and the maize stalks were brittle and pale. Whispers spread through the village like dry leaves in the wind. "It's a curse," some said. "We must have angered the spirits," said others. But one thing was clear, the famine had come swiftly as if drawn by an unseen hand. And yet there was one place untouched. Inside the Nwoko compound, the small corner of garden where Ebel often worked remained alive. The vegetables there glowed with color, their leaves strong and lush even as the rest of the land withered. The soil beneath her hands seemed to hum softly, rich and dark, breathing life when everything else fell silent. At first, Madame Nwoko tried to claim the miracle as her own doing. "The ancestors blessed this house," she told the villagers, standing tall with false pride. But her words rang hollow. The servants whispered that it was not her prayers that kept the plants alive, it was the young wife she starved, the one who watered the soil with her tears. When people came to see for themselves, they found Ebel kneeling quietly in the garden, her hands brushing over the leaves as though greeting old friends. The plants bent slightly toward her as if drawn by her touch. Children peeked from behind the fence, watching with wide eyes. An elder woman crossed herself and muttered, "The mother's spirit lives in her blood." As the festival day approached, the contrast grew impossible to ignore. The drums still beat, but the joy felt thin. The grand feast could not be prepared, there was too little to cook. Only the food from the Nwoko garden seemed untouched by the famine. That night, as the villagers gathered in the square, the elders called for a meeting. They lit a fire and asked Madame Nwoko to speak of her blessing. But before she could boast again, a young girl stepped forward and said softly, "It is not her blessing. I have seen Ebel's hands in the garden. Where she walks, green follows. Where she prays, rain falls." The crowd murmured. All eyes turned to Ebel, who stood at the edge of the firelight, thin but radiant, her calm presence steady as the earth itself. Madame Nwoko's face tightened, her voice trembling. "She is a witch," she spat. "She brings famine so that she alone may feed." But even as she spoke, a soft breeze stirred the air. The dying fire crackled higher, and a faint scent of fresh rain drifted through the night. The villagers lifted their faces to the sky, and saw clouds gathering for the first time in months. Ebel lowered her head, whispering a quiet prayer. Her mother's words echoed in her soul. What they withhold, the earth will give. And as the first drops of rain touched the parched ground, the people knew the truth. It was not hunger that had made her weak, it was hunger that had revealed her strength. The next morning, the elders of the village arrived at the Nwoko compound, their staffs tapping against the earth like the rhythm of judgment itself. They came dressed in woven wrappers and beads, their faces marked with lines of wisdom and years of watching men's pride destroy homes. Behind them trailed a crowd, villagers hungry not just for food but for truth. Madame Nwoko greeted them with her most practiced smile. "Elders, welcome," she said, bowing slightly. "I knew you would come to witness the blessings our ancestors have poured upon this family. Even in famine, our compound thrives." Ebel stood in the background, silent, her eyes lowered. She clutched her wrapper to keep her trembling hands still. The elders settled beneath the mango tree, and one of them, a tall man named Elder Okafor, spoke in a deep, steady voice. "We have seen the miracle with our own eyes, Madame Nwoko. But tell us, whose hands brought it forth?" Madame Nwoko's smile did not falter. "It was mine," she said smoothly. "Each morning I offered libations and songs to the ancestors. I fasted for days, prayed for rain, and sprinkled holy ash over the soil. These are the fruits of my faith." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded cautiously, others looked doubtful. But before Elder Okafor could reply, a sudden gust of wind swept through the compound, cold, sharp, and strange. The leaves rustled, and the air itself seemed to hum. The elders looked around in surprise. The wind grew stronger, swirling around the garden like an unseen spirit in motion. Madame Nwoko stepped back, her wrapper snapping in the air. "What is this?" she shouted. But the elders did not move. They watched as the wind lifted dust and chaff from the ground, scattering them in circles until the once green garden lay bare. Then, as the dust settled, gasps broke out among the crowd. The soil revealed pale markings, streaks of dried tears tracing through the earth. And from each streak, tiny sprouts had grown, bright green and alive. Every vine, every leaf that had once flourished had taken root along those lines. It was as though the land itself had remembered who had truly nourished it. Elder Okafor stepped forward, his eyes wide. "These are not prayers of the proud," he said slowly. "These are tears of the humble. The earth knows who has fed it." Madame Nwoko stumbled backward, her face draining of color. "No. It cannot be. I did everything. I am the head of this house." But the wind rose again, whistling through the air like a chorus of unseen voices. The villagers could almost hear words within it, faint, ancient whispers saying, "Truth cannot stay buried." The elders turned toward Ebel, who now stood bathed in sunlight that pierced through the trees. Her eyes shimmered, not with pride but with calm sorrow. She bowed before them and said quietly, "I only tended to what my heart could bear. I did not seek to be known." Elder Okafor lifted his staff and struck it once upon the ground. "Then let it be known," he declared. "The one who was starved has fed us all. The one who was called weak has become the root of our survival." A hush fell over the crowd. Some villagers knelt. Others began to sing softly, a song of gratitude, a hymn to the woman whose tears had grown life from dust. Madame Nwoko collapsed to her knees, her head bowed, unable to speak. The truth had risen, unstoppable as the wind that carried it. And Ebel, the woman they had starved to break, stood unbroken, her quiet strength shining brighter than any blessing claimed by deceit. The village square was heavy with the weight of silence as the elders gathered, their robes whispering across the dusted ground, carrying the gravitas of countless generations. Their eyes, sharp and unyielding, scanned the crowd that had assembled, villagers who had witnessed the sudden famine, the withering crops, and the quiet resilience of Ebel's small garden. The air thrummed with tension, as though the very wind waited for a verdict, and in that pause, hearts thumped loudly in the ears of those who had known only fear and suspicion for far too long. Ebel stood at the edge of the square, her hands clasped tightly, not in anger but in a quiet, unwavering faith that had sustained her through nights when hunger gnawed and whispers of doubt threatened to settle in the minds of even the most faithful villagers. Her garden, small yet defiantly green, seemed almost to glow under the harsh sun, each leaf a testament to patience, perseverance, and the unseen strength of belief. Madame Nwoko, who had for years ruled with arrogance and cruelty, attempted to maintain her composure, but the subtle tremor in her fingers betrayed her unease. She had prided herself on her wealth, her abundance, and the control she wielded over the people through her storehouses full of grain, yet now, for the first time, the cracks in her authority were visible to all. The elders raised their staffs, their eyes reflecting the wisdom of the ages, and began to chant in low resonant tones that carried across the square like a slow drumbeat. The villagers felt it in their chests, a vibration that made them both anxious and hopeful. They could sense that something extraordinary was about to unfold, something that would confirm the truths they had only dared whisper behind closed doors. As the chant grew, a strange wind rose, swirling through the square with a purposeful rhythm, lifting dust and scattering leaves from the surrounding trees. Madame Nwoko's storehouses, once symbols of her power, began to emit a pungent odor. The grains within swelled and turned black, rotting before the eyes of the gathered crowd. The villagers gasped, stepping back instinctively, yet no one could deny the sight. The decay was relentless, as if the earth itself were rejecting the injustice that had been perpetuated for so long. Meanwhile, Ebel's garden thrived in stark contrast. Tiny sprouts stretched toward the sun, buds opening as if to whisper secrets of renewal and resilience. Flowers bloomed in colors so vivid they seemed almost unreal, and the air around the garden carried a gentle fragrance, a reminder of the quiet power of faith nurtured with love and care. The elders turned toward Madame Nwoko, their voices now rising above the wind, speaking with clarity and authority. They recounted her misdeeds, the manipulations, and the cruelty she had inflicted upon the villagers, particularly upon Ebel. Each word struck like a hammer, shattering the veneer of superiority that Madame Nwoko had carefully constructed over the years. The villagers listened, some trembling, some nodding in agreement, as the stories unfolded with unflinching honesty. They saw not only the harm she had caused but also the consequences of her actions manifesting so clearly before them: rotting food, wasted wealth, and the undeniable vitality of Ebel's faith and perseverance. Ebel's heart did not swell with triumph or bitterness. She felt only the quiet satisfaction that comes when truth is finally recognized, when patience and integrity are proven stronger than fear and cruelty. She stepped forward, her voice calm yet firm, and thanked the elders for guiding the village and revealing the reality hidden beneath years of deception. She spoke of faith, not as a word or a ritual, but as a living, breathing force that shapes actions, nourishes hope, and fosters resilience even in the harshest of circumstances. The villagers absorbed her words, feeling their meaning seep into their hearts, a lesson in humility and the power of steadfastness. Madame Nwoko, her pride reduced to a shadow of itself, retreated from the square, her eyes avoiding those of the villagers she had once sought to control. There was no violence, no dramatic confrontation, only the natural, inexorable unfolding of justice as the balance of the village shifted, quietly yet irrevocably. Ebel's garden remained, a living testament to the principle that true strength lies not in hoarded wealth but in unwavering faith, compassion, and integrity. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the square, the villagers began to understand that this reckoning was more than a punishment. It was a lesson, a story to be told for generations, and a reminder that the power of the human spirit, guided by faith, cannot be diminished by cruelty or fear. The wind carried the scent of blooming flowers into every corner of the village, and for the first time in weeks, the air felt alive, as though the land itself were celebrating Ebel's quiet triumph. Children ran to the garden, touching the soft leaves and marveling at the flowers, while elders nodded knowingly, aware that the legacy of this day would endure far longer than any storehouse of grain. The village, once paralyzed by fear and injustice, had awakened to a new understanding of strength, faith, and the enduring power of the human spirit. And at the center of it all, Ebel stood serene, her face reflecting both relief and the quiet joy of one who has seen truth prevail, knowing that her belief had been the seed from which this reckoning had grown. The village square was alive with movement and color as the sun rose, casting golden light over the fields that had once struggled under famine but now thrived under Ebel's careful care. Villagers bustled to and fro, carrying baskets, setting tables, and preparing for the feast that would mark not just the harvest, but a rebirth of faith, hope, and community. Children ran between the adults, laughing and chasing one another, their joy contagious, a stark contrast to the fearful, hushed whispers that had once filled the same streets. Ebel moved among them, her hands steady as she distributed baskets of fresh produce, grain, and fruits. She offered each item with warmth and humility, never letting her own triumph eclipse the needs of those around her. Her presence, serene yet powerful, seemed to fill the air with a subtle glow, and the villagers felt themselves drawn to her, not out of obligation, but out of respect and admiration for the strength she had quietly embodied. The poor and needy, who had suffered the most during the famine, were the first to receive her gifts. They looked at the overflowing baskets with wide eyes, disbelief and gratitude mingling on their faces. Many had doubted that abundance could return, Yet here it was, tangible and real, a gift born not from wealth or manipulation, but from faith, resilience and care. Mothers held their children close, whispering prayers of thanks as they received the crops, and elders nodded with satisfaction, recognizing that the true prosperity of a village lies not in stockpiles or hoarded riches, but in the well-being of its people. Even the fields themselves seemed to rejoice, the wind carrying the fragrance of ripened crops through every corner of the village. Ebel's small garden had grown into a lush plot, overflowing with vegetables, fruits and flowers. Every plant was a testament to her patience, perseverance and unseen strength. Villagers began to mirror her actions, tending to the soil, planting seeds and sharing knowledge about cultivation and care. A renewed sense of unity spread like wildfire, binding the community together through a shared experience of recovery and hope. As the feast commenced, tables were laden with food, laughter echoing across the square. Ebel's husband, once proud and distant, approached her. His eyes were lowered, his steps hesitant, yet each carried the weight of recognition and respect. Kneeling before her, he acknowledged the depth of her strength, a strength that had not been loud or ostentatious, but steadfast and unwavering. He felt the shame of underestimating her, tempered by awe for the courage, patience and faith she had displayed. The villagers watched in silence, some offering nods of approval, others murmuring blessings, and all understanding that the true measure of power was not in dominance, but in the quiet fortitude that transforms lives. By the end of the day, the village had been reborn. Hunger and fear had been replaced with abundance and hope. Ebel was celebrated not only for the harvest she had nurtured, but for the spirit she had awakened within every villager. From that day forward, she was known as the woman of the hidden strength, a living testament to the power of faith, resilience, and compassion. And as the sun set, painting the sky with hues of pink and gold, the village knew that their lives had been forever changed, guided by the quiet, enduring strength of a woman who had turned adversity into a feast of renewal. Long after Ebel's garden had bloomed and the village had returned to life, her story did not fade with time. Generations later, the elders would gather the children around the fires at dusk, their faces glowing in the flickering light, and tell the tale of the woman who had been starved, yet fed the land itself. They spoke with reverence, their voices weaving the memory of Ebel's courage into a tapestry of lessons, so that each child would carry the knowledge that true strength is not measured by what one possesses, but by what one endures and gives. Her name echoed through the village, whispered with awe and respect, a reminder that cruelty can attempt to break the human spirit, but cannot succeed when faith and resilience stand firm. The children listened, wide-eyed, imagining the small, determined woman who had faced hunger and ridicule yet refused to bow to fear or despair. They pictured her tending her tiny garden, her hands nurturing sprouts that grew into abundance while the storehouses of the cruel lay in ruin. They imagined her sharing her harvest with the poor, restoring hope to a land that had forgotten the meaning of generosity and care. Each retelling emphasized not just her triumph, but the principle she embodied, that strength rooted in spirit, in faith and love, cannot be starved, cannot be crushed and cannot be stolen. The elders would often pause, letting the words sink deep into young hearts. Those who thought to weaken her forgot. They said, their voices grave yet tender, that strength that comes from spirit cannot be starved. And the children, inspired by the courage of one woman, learned to value perseverance, empathy, and the quiet power of faith. Ebel became more than a memory, she became a symbol, a legend whose lessons guided the choices and actions of the village for decades. Even in the laughter of the children, in the fertile fields, and in the generosity shared among neighbors, Ebel's spirit endured. The story reminded everyone that adversity, cruelty, and hunger could challenge the body but never the soul. Her life became a proverb, a living teaching, that a starved body cannot diminish a spirit that feeds the land, nurtures the community, and inspires generations. And so, the legend of Ebel, the starved bride, lived on, whispered beside fires, passed from hand to hand, heart to heart, ensuring that the hidden strength within one woman could shape the destiny of an entire village and echo through time.